This screencast is looking at the introduction to the three energy systems. So how is energy resynthesized for physical activity? On completion of this unit, the student should be able to analyse the role and relative contribution of the energy systems during physical activity. And going on from there, we look at energy systems, we look at fatigue, and we look at recovery. The fatigue and the recovery are both to do with the energy systems. So we're not looking at this point to ice baths, massage. Both the fatigue is to do with the energy systems and recovery is to do with the energy systems. So some key knowledge: the food and chemical fuels required for ATP resynthesis, characteristics of the three energy systems. Now the characteristics will tend to be the rate at which the energy systems can resynthesize ATP and the capacity of the energy systems. So this is referring to how long the energy systems can efficiently resynthesize ATP at various intensities. The relative contribution of fuels during exercise, the relative contribution of energy systems during exercise, and then fatigue mechanisms and our practical application of energy systems to sport. The sports could really come into two different parts. One could be a continuous activity. Two would be our normal sort of team sport where there's intermittent rest and recovery. So here we're looking at the difference between a power type athlete and an endurance based athlete. So when we look at muscular contraction, the power athlete's muscular contraction required will be greater, the endurance less. Our energy demand for a power athlete will be greater, for the endurance will be less. How we resynthesize will be different. For our power athlete, it will tend to be anaerobic, meaning no oxygen. For our aerobic athlete, it will tend to be predominantly with oxygen. So this is in essence what is happening. Here we have ATP. So ATP is our energy molecule. So ATP, energy molecule for muscular contraction. It is made up of one adenosine and three phosphates, hence adenosine triphosphate. The first step is that one of these phosphates splits from the adenosine triphosphate. That leaves us with adenosine diphosphate, so adenosine and two phosphates. And we're left with an inorganic phosphate. That's the one there that has split off. And when a molecule is separated, energy is released. Now this energy here that's being released, this is used for muscular contraction. The three energy systems, so the the 3 different ones, they look at reconnecting the inorganic phosphate back with the adenosine diphosphate to again make ATP. So energy systems are used to resynthesize ATP. ATP is broken down so that muscular contraction can occur. So the two things that basically control which of the energy systems will be predominant, and we need to understand that all 3 energy systems are used at the one time. However, one of those systems will be predominant. So the two things that determine this are, 1, our intensity of activity, and secondly, duration of activity. So which of these two is more important? Which one's more important? Is it the intensity or is it the duration? You can pause this presentation and have a think for a minute and then return to it to find out an answer. So which is it? Intensity or is it duration? A simple little test. If you're sitting down not doing anything, the intensity of the activity would suggest that it's very low, so the required rate of energy would be very low. So sitting down, required rate would be very low. Whether you do it for 4 seconds or whether you do it for 1 hour isn't going to particularly matter. The aerobic system would be predominant because of the very low rate that's required. However, if we were sprinting, so we do a 6-second flat out sprint, the intensity here, or the required rate, is very high. The duration is low, it's the 6 seconds. So we have a very low duration, or very short duration. Could we do this for 1 hour? No, we couldn't. We couldn't maintain that type of speed. So here, hopefully it's fairly clear that the most important of the two is exercise intensity. So that's the most important as to which energy system will be predominant. Again, looking at a power athlete, here a sprinter versus a marathon runner, we use the two terms rate and yield. So the rate is how quickly ATP needs to be resynthesized, and yield is how much in total needs to be resynthesized. So comparing these two athletes, the rate of ATP required is going to be much greater for our sprinter because they work at a greater speed. So it's going to be much, much greater than for our marathon runner because they work at a lower intensity with respect to speed. The yield is going to be much, much greater for our marathon runner. So over an entire marathon, they're going to require more ATP to be resynthesized than our sprinter, which is a low yield in total. So again, terms we're using are rate, referring to how quickly ATP needs to be resynthesized, and yield, what's the total amount for the event. So why can't we just simply have stored ATP within our body and use that as the fuel for everything? It comes down to the weight. ATP is very heavy. At any one point in time, we've got approximately 50 grams of ATP stored within our body, which doesn't seem much, but over 24 hours, we use approximately, and this is for a 70 kilogram male, we use approximately 190 kilograms of ATP. That's how much we need to resynthesize over 24 hours. So that's a lot. So food and chemical fuels. These fuels are used by energy systems to resynthesize ATP. Food, I'll asterisk as green. Chemical, red. So, phosphocreatine. Phosphocreatine is used by the ATP PC energy system, and it is found in the muscle. Carbohydrates are used for either the anaerobic glycolysis energy system or for the aerobic energy system. We take it in as carbohydrate, as our food fuel. However, it's stored as the chemical fuel of glucose and glycogen. Our fats are used for the aerobic energy system. They're taken into the body as fats. They are stored as free fatty acids in the blood, or transported as free fatty acids in the blood, as triglycerides in the muscle. In excess, it's stored as body fat or adipose tissue. Protein for the aerobic system. However, we don't concentrate on looking at proteins for energy resynthesis for sporting endeavours. Protein is going to be used predominantly in stages of starvation. So when it comes to looking at the process by which the aerobic energy system resynthesizes energy, we don't look at protein. Rate versus yield. Which do we think of PC, of glucose, of our triglycerides? Which is going to break down the most quickly, being rate, and which has the greatest capacity? So within 1 gram, what's going to have more ATP produced from it? Feel free to pause and have a think. Apologies for that, we're now back at the right spot. So phosphocreatine, carbohydrates or fat. If we're looking at rate, phosphocreatine will be broken down the most quickly, then carbohydrates, and then fats. However, if we're looking at yield, then it's going to be the reverse. Fat will have a greater amount of energy per gram, then carbohydrates, and then phosphocreatine. So why do we actually need ATP to be resynthesized? Why do we need energy? The answer is that for our muscles to contract, so that is generate force. Now that could be with muscles either shortening, it could be muscles lengthening. So when they shorten and generate a force, it's concentric contraction. When they lengthen and generate a force, it's called eccentric contraction. But for the muscles to shorten, lengthen, but for them to generate force, they require ATP to be resynthesized. So in a second, we're just going to have a look at a little video clip that will explain this. So I want you to take note of a couple of things. ATP, our adenosine diphosphate, so the di meaning two, and our inorganic phosphate, and also the role of calcium.
Each sarcomere consists of thick filaments of myosin, shown in purple, and thin filaments of actin, shown in orange. A sarcomere contracts when its actin filaments slide past its myosin filaments. Contraction shortens the sarcomere, but does not change the length of the actin or myosin filaments. The myosin filaments have heads that bind and pull actin repeatedly, shortening the sarcomere. How do the myosin heads pull actin? In a relaxed muscle, the myosin-binding sites on actin are blocked by a protein complex, and ADP and phosphate are bound to each myosin head. An action potential causes the ER to release calcium ions, which bind to the protein complex, causing it to shift and expose the myosin-binding sites. The myosin head binds to actin. When ADP and phosphate are released, the myosin head bends, pulling the actin. This is called the power stroke. Next, ATP binds to the myosin head, causing it to detach from actin. When the ATP is broken down to ADP and phosphate, the myosin head extends. The sequence repeats as long as calcium ions are present. Bind, power stroke, detach, extend. The combined work of many myosin heads causes the actin filaments to slide past the myosin filaments. When the action potentials stop, calcium ions are pumped back into the ER. The myosin-binding sites on actin are again blocked, and the muscle relaxes.
So hopefully from that little video, you'll be able to see that ATP, not until it is split into ADP and inorganic phosphate, is it able to actually pull to shorten the muscle, and that without calcium present in the muscle, this process will not take place. The breakdown of ATP, we've already looked at this. This is just a different diagram from our textbook. Again, another worded description. This is a little visual over here that ATP is charged when ATP is split into our adenosine diphosphate and inorganic phosphate. the energy has been released for muscular contraction, and at that point it becomes uncharged. To recharge it, we need to use one of the three energy systems to relink the inorganic phosphate back to the adenosine diphosphate to recreate adenosine triphosphate. So we have three methods of producing ATP. It depends on whether they are active or resting, the intensity of the activity, and also, as we looked at, the duration of activity, with intensity being the most important. And that will take into account whether we're active or resting. The three systems, two are anaerobic, meaning that they do not use oxygen. The first is the ATP-PC energy system. The second is the anaerobic glycolysis system. The third system is aerobic, so we only have the one, and it uses oxygen in the process. So our ATP-PC system, the fuel is either PC or CP, doesn't matter which way you write that around, just the creatine phosphate. It will be the dominant system of high intense activity up to around about 6 to 7 seconds. The anaerobic glycolysis system, formerly referred to as the lactic acid energy system. So in a previous exam, previous SAC, you may see a question that refers to a lactic acid energy system. However, if you write down lactic acid energy system in this year's exam, you will be marked incorrect. So make sure you use the term anaerobic glycolysis. Its fuel, glucose. It is the predominant system from around about 7 seconds through to 30 seconds of intense activity, and will tend to be the dominant system for an activity that lasts between 10 to 60 seconds. The aerobic energy system, glucose, triglycerides as its fuel. The free fatty acids are in the blood. When they get transported into the muscle, will convert to triglycerides. It'll reach its peak output at around about 1 through to 2 minutes. So it'll take around about 1 to 2 minutes to reach its peak. Using glucose within the aerobic system will tend to be dominant from around about the 1 minute mark through to 120-minute mark. If we're looking at the use of free fatty acids, then we're looking at it from 3 to 4 hours being the predominant fuel within the aerobic system. So the term we use when we run out of available glucose is hitting the wall, and that will occur anywhere from sort of 90 minutes through to our 2 hours. So that's hitting the wall. And it's when we run out of available glucose. Obviously, we don't run out of all glucose. Our brain requires glucose. So if we ran out of all glucose, we would in fact die. This is the graph for which we need to relate to the interplay of energy systems. Please note that this was produced by Vika before the change from lactic to anaerobic glycolysis. So here we can see the time frame. If we look at our ATP PC system, we can see that it peaks at around about 5 seconds. The anaerobic glycolysis system will become predominant at around about the 7-second mark. It will peak in here at around about 15 through to 20 seconds. The aerobic energy system will become predominant at around about that 30-second mark, and it will peak at somewhere from just over a minute through to about the 2-minute mark. And the last thing we're going to look at is applying key terms. So here we're looking at power, capacity, rate, and yield, and with respect to intensity and duration. So if we look at a sprinter, it requires more power. It has a very, very high rate required, very fast rate. It is of a very high intensity. The duration is very short. The yield that is required is small, and the capacity of the predominant system based on these things is going to be small. Now, based on high power, fast rate, high intensity, short duration, small yield, ATP-PC system would be the major provider. If we look at a marathon, we have a low or less power. The required rate of energy production is slow. The intensity is lower. The duration is long. Our yield is very large, and the capacity of the predominant system is going to have to be very large. Now, as a result of less power, slower rate, lower intensity, longer duration, and a very high yield, the predominant system would be the aerobic energy system. So this is how we would explain or justify whether one system was predominant